Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary, this is a moment of extreme cognitive dissonance. We have before us a motion that there's a climate emergency that was tabled May 16th and then adjourned for a month. For an emergency, we shouldn't be adjourning debate, nor should we have closure on debate. The issue is this, and I think the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary will probably try to find some way to agree with me on this. The motion calls for us to declare a climate emergency, and then the motion calls for us to ignore it. Because the motion says we should commit to meeting the national emissions target tabled under the Paris Agreement, which is the one left behind by Stephen Harper, which was developed in a complete void. It had nothing to do with the negotiations that hadn't yet happened. But if we're going to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Parliamentary Secretary, I ask him to please explain and put on record when his party and his government will update the Harper target under which we are still operating, such that it can be consistent with what the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, warned us in October of last year must be done, which is approximately doubling current efforts.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, I don't view it. We're seeking to ignore the nature of the emergency that we're declaring by virtue of this motion. In fact, we tried to use broad-based language that removed most of the politics from it by avoiding discussions of our specific efforts in hopes that we could just address the issue. The target that is most important to me is the one that will get us to 1.5 degrees. We know that's where we need to be. But with respect to the target that the honourable member referred to that the government has used, it's a starting point in my mind that was negotiated with the provinces and territories as we were arriving at the Pan-Canadian framework. We know we need to continue to aim for deeper and deeper reductions to get where we need to be, and I look forward to the upcoming campaign where we're going to be canvassing not only the ideas that we've already implemented, but identifying a path forward so Canadians see how we can get there to avoid the worst consequences of climate change.
Question to my friend from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, recognizing the depth of his commitment and the depth of his understanding of the science. I'd like to focus on what we can do together by recognizing it's a climate emergency. My honourable colleague just used a figure that's close to what the IPCC said, that we have to, their report released October 8th of last year said that in order to avoid going above 1.5 degrees, global average temperature increase, and they identified that going above that represented an area of such extreme danger, catastrophic impacts that could wipe out human civilization. We really have no choice but to try to hold to 1.5. They say that the world overall must reduce emissions by 45% against 2010 levels by 2030. When I crunch the numbers and look at Canada, because we're so far behind everyone else, we're still dealing with people who think it's okay to build new pipelines and expand the emissions of greenhouse gases. I crunch it and come down to Canada should be reducing to 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. We have to get our target right and our trajectory right, or we'll never achieve what must be done. And I just wonder if he has any thoughts on that. What's the appropriate target for Canada, given how much, as the honourable member said quite rightly, we are running out of time?
The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Sandwich Gulf Islands for that question and for her commitment to this issue. And, you know, the issue of what's the right targets, I think the real important target is that we have to get to net zero, and let's say we have to get there by the middle of the century. We have to do that. I think right now the government says 80% by then. But that's the important target. Whether we get, you know, 40% by 2030, 60% by 2040, 100% by 2050, I think it's not so much important whether you get all those targets exactly right, but this target that we are going for right now, 30% by 2030, and we're not going to get there. That's where I think the big failure is. That's where I think this government has to change its targets and then change its plan to actually meet these better targets, targets that will make a difference.
My honourable friend from Kootenay, Columbia, I think we all feel this, those of us who really understand the climate science, and I know he does, something of a sense of despair when we're debating a climate emergency motion from the government. And if we take it seriously that this is an emergency and we understand the science, then the inevitable consequence is that we must plan a carbon budget in which we systematically reduce, and ultimately stop using fossil fuels altogether. We must, in that process, include a transition for the transferable skills from workers. One great example I'll give is that the orphaned oil wells, and there are thousands of them throughout Alberta and northern BC, actually have tremendous potential for geothermal energy production, because the biggest cost for geothermal is drilling to go down deep below the Earth's surface. The same people who drilled it as an oil well can help manage it as a geothermal facility. But we're paralyzed by the notion that if we want to save ourselves, someone might be out of work. Saving ourselves and ensuring our children have a livable world must be our #1 consideration. And I ask the honourable member for his sense of this disconnect in which we find ourselves.
The honourable member for Kootenay-Columbia, just a little over a minute to respond.
You know, there is such a sense of urgency amongst our youth, and I have to give all credit to the youth for really driving this question and making all politicians around the world pay attention to climate change. They're concerned about their future. And absolutely, the member is absolutely right about the opportunity around green energy. When you look at the possibilities for geothermal, for solar, for wind, and if you're in the ocean areas, tidal energy, it is amazing. And what it means is you don't have to travel from Newfoundland or other parts of the country or my riding of Kootenay-Columbia to Alberta for gainful employment. If we move to a green energy economy, those jobs will stay right at home. So you don't even have to leave home. You can have a good job and a better future for your families as well as for the economy. So it's there. We just have to make sure we do the transition properly.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by thanking my honourable colleague from Dartmouth, Cole Harbour, for graciously sharing his time with me. This emergency debate is now under time allocation. It started over a month ago, and this is my first occasion to be able to speak to the various reasons that I want to support both the Liberal motion that this is a climate emergency and the Conservative amendment that would require that we do something more rigorous about it. I have already voted in favor of the NDP motion to similar effect to call this a climate emergency. So I want to back up and set this in a context that is indeed global, and I'm going to attempt to do this in as non-partisan a fashion as possible. Parce que maintenant c'est clair que nous sommes dans une situation.
Because it's now clear that we're in a climate emergency. This is worldwide. And the true threat to our future is not a foreign enemy. It is our human nature. We have a political problem. We have a partisanship problem. And in every democracy, these create obstacles for the scientific community that understands that we have to act.
Around the world, the same circumstance prevails, that there is a very large obstacle for people in elected office to do what needs to be done, because in one country after another, they face domestic obstacles of what's politically possible. We're in a very serious crisis now. The words climate emergency apply because we've been told by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we have at most 10 years, and likely less, to ensure that we hit the required target for 2030, to ensure we can hit the targets required by 2050. I want to underscore that these are not political targets. They are non-negotiable. Political targets can be missed. Oh, you can try. Goodness knows how often Canada has missed targets to end child poverty. It's not a good thing. Not at all. We've missed targets to provide safe drinking water in First Nations reserves. We take targets in this place and we name them. The targets around climate action in a climate emergency are essentially scientists telling us as elected people, you've only got one chance. I've been working on this issue, by the way, Madam Speaker, since 1986 when I was in the Minister of Environment's office. We had a lot of chances then. Procrastination has left us where we are right now. There is no time for incrementalism anymore. We have run out of time for small tweaks. We actually are in a place where if we're going to ensure our children have a livable world and human civilization does not break down in their lifetimes, couldn't be much more serious than that, we have to accept that we're in a climate emergency that means status quo behavior is over. Which also means that in our political context, we have to do things differently. So we're on the verge of an election in Canada. How likely is it, I look around this room, how likely is it that we can set aside partisanship to do the right thing? Well, currently, the term climate emergency has been accepted by 2 countries. The UK and Ireland have accepted that this is a climate emergency. I think it's very important and historic that Canada do the same. We need mobilization and increased effort from all countries on Earth. But, and I should also say the level of government in Canada that has already done the most is the municipal order of government, where we have seen many, many cities and towns declare climate emergencies. From this city where we are today in Ottawa, Vancouver, Victoria, Halifax, we are seeing many communities stand up and say this is a climate emergency. But the point of it isn't just to hear ourselves talk. The point of it is to say, and I repeat, status quo behavior is over. We can't continue to talk about whether a carbon tax is a good wedge issue in politics. We can't have people talking about this election campaign as if we're just going to duke it out over whether the Liberal carbon tax plan is a good or a bad idea. That's not a relevant question, honestly. In a climate emergency, the only question that matters is, do the plans we have in place avoid climate breakdown and preserve human civilization? The answer to that is tragically no. We know the target that we're currently operating under as a country, what's called a nationally determined contribution at the United Nations, is wholly inadequate to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, what would we do if this was really a climate emergency? Well, it is a climate emergency, but what if every party in this place and every leader in this place understood what it meant? Number one, we'd have to agree that we're going off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And then we start where we need to be. By 2050, we need to have zero emissions globally. Then we need to respond to global calls for action. I want to put on the table that this is a place where we could really cooperate as parties. In this place, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has called for an emergency gathering to face the climate crisis and to call on countries around the world to improve their targets and respond appropriately. Now, this emergency climate summit is scheduled for September 23rd this year, in conjunction with the annual meeting of the UN General Assembly. The next climate negotiations, COP25, begin in Santiago, Chile, in December. Now, when you hear the words, and for members here, obviously, September 23rd, all of us as elected people are thinking, oh, but we'll be in the middle of a campaign. What if we decided to take a page out of Greta Thunberg from Sweden, her actions for climate strike? What if we decided that the climate emergency was so serious, we were going to have a campaign strike? We'd all go to New York, tell the Prime Minister it really matters that you be there. We know we're in an election campaign, but don't worry. The Conservative leader, the New Democrat leader, the Green Party leader, Bloc leader, People's Party leader will go to New York together to a UN summit where we will declare Canada is committed to going off fossil fuels 100% by 2050. This is the timeline by which we will do it. We will cut our emissions in Canada by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. Because if you don't set an ambitious target, you can't get to it ever. It's like saying our current target is as if we had a building on fire, a 4-story building, and we say we have meaningful action because we've erected a stepladder that gets to the 1st story. We have to get to 4 stories and rescue people who are on the roof surrounded by flames. In that context, incrementalism is not enough. The climate emergency is just such a context in which more is required of us. And even in this election year, I put before you that we need to stop our status quo behavior. Central to the Green Party's mission possible is that we put ourselves on a warlike footing. Again, it's not an external enemy. It's our own conduct, our own behavior, and we have the opportunity to save our children from an unthinkable world. The opportunity to achieve that, the window of opportunity, will close on us before the 2023 election. The trajectory to get to where we need to be by 2030 needs to begin rather quickly, rather sharply. And Canada right now has a poor record in the rest of the world. Most of the countries who signed on to the Kyoto Protocol are well below 1990 levels of emissions by now. Scotland is at 40% below 1990 levels. And here we are in Canada, still well above 1990 levels. If we hit the Harper target under which we're still functioning, we'd be a little bit below 1990. But as we've heard recently from anyone who studies it, the cumulative actions yet announced by the current government fall far short of that target. But that target itself, again, is the one-story ladder when we need to get to the 4 stories and rescue people from the roof. So, Madam Speaker, in the time remaining, I just want to emphasize, if it's an emergency, then we change the way we behave. If it's an emergency, we set aside the partisanship and say, we've got to do this together. We've got to do it together as Canadians. We've got to say to absolutely Canadians from coast to coast to coast, this is something we do together. All hands on deck. Tout le monde sur le pont. C'est une question d'urgence.
This is an emergency. We need to act, and we need to act together.
Despite all the obvious nastiness of partisan politics that I ask us not to think about poll results and seat counts, but our children's future. We need to work together.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I always appreciate the leader of Green Party's comments on a variety of different issues, in particular dealing with the environment. I think that we have seen some significant budgetary and legislative measures to take a look in terms of how we can improve our conditions here in Canada, whether it's the price on pollution, which is a fairly significant program that originates out of the Paris Agreement, to some of the incentives that are provided through budget to try to get individuals, consumers, to purchase more electrical vehicles, to many of the different departments, like the previous speaker talking about the Department of Defense, a small but important, from going from a C-130 from a search and rescue to a C-295 is something that I would suggest to you is very much healthy on the environment. And I wonder if the leader of the Green Party would maybe provide some thoughts that not only is it important for us to look at the bigger picture, but for the individuals ministers to look at ways in which they can also make a difference from within their departments.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. There's a list of things that can be done and should be done by every minister, by every citizen. The list is long because our opportunities are endless. The difficulty is, as long as we keep operating in the status quo world with blinders on, where we can say, well, the Liberal climate policy is that we're way better than the Conservatives. We'll see what the Conservatives offer later this week, but the reality of it is, until and unless we accept our responsibilities to have the right targets to mobilize action, we will never be able, with the cumulative small efforts, we're still just losing our chances for human survival a little bit more slowly than with parties that say climate change doesn't exist. So it's really going to be harder for politicians on this issue than on most, because the issue is unforgiving and there is no negotiating with the atmosphere.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Saanich Gulf Islands for her speech. And I just want to be clear on what the Green Party would do in this light. My understanding is that they're opposed to fossil fuels. They would oppose building additional pipelines. They are in favor of the carbon tax and against the use of plastics. Is that correct?
The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Correct up to a point, Madam Speaker. The honourable friend from Sarnia will find our policies both in Vision Green, which is on our website in deep detail, and Mission Possible, which is intended to be that ambitious rallying around call for Canadians to go off fossil fuels. But yes, absolutely, we are any fossil fuel infrastructure expansion is inconsistent with our own planetary survival and continuation of human civilization. We're not against the use of all plastics. That's the one place where I would disagree. We, in fact, think that bitumen production can be changed from fossil fuel production to feedstock for petrochemicals, but particularly for durable plastics, not single-use plastics.
For a brief question, the honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you to the member for Sandwich Gulf Islands for her speech. I share many of her concerns on this file. Just with respect, one of the things I find troubling in the current atmosphere is we seem to be debating the current costs of the carbon tax. I'm just wondering if she can illuminate for this House what the future projections are for the costs of unmitigated climate change and how those will absolutely dwarf any kind of figures we're talking about presently.
The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Highlands has just about a minute.
Oh, well, that's a lot of time. Thank you, Madam Speaker. To my friend from Cowichan, Malahat Langford, if this is one of those frustrating things about this debate, is that it's not about what it costs to take action on climate. It's about what it saves. And what it saves is human life. What it saves is our communities. We're looking at a situation just within Canada where we have had people dying from a heat wave in Montreal. La canicule à Montréal l'année passée.
Last year, there was a heat wave in Montreal, and that directly, I believe, 37 people in Montreal died because of the heat wave, which came as a result of climate change.
In terms of infrastructure loss in the billions and billions of dollars. But that's where we are now at 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase. If even holding to 1.5 as hard as it is, will imply billions of dollars more loss every year, and then developing countries are going to need our help. There'll be environmental refugees coming here. The costs of inaction far exceed the opportunities that are created that actually will, in fact, revitalize and modernize our economy.